hear our speaker. I remind you the cycle of conferences started in 2005. Today we have 300 and plus conferences that you can download from the webpage of the Center for Chinese-Mexican Studies, that and the cycle is being organized together with Professor Yolanda Trápaga Delfín. No? I invite you to participate in the next weeks. We do this cycle of conferences every 2 weeks, and we will have a good group of interesting conferences until the end of the semester and of the year, according to the academic cycle of UNAM. Today, I'm particularly thankful to Professor Gary Gereffi for participating. We had a small and minor problem regarding the time zone in Mexico City. We just changed on Sunday our time, and so Gary was very kindly an hour ahead waiting, and I didn't understand what was happening, but here we are. Thank you very much for everybody for your patience. No? I remind you, Professor Gary Gereffi, he's an emeritus professor at Duke University, and he's the founding director at the Global Value Chain Center, also at Duke University. He has he did his BA from the University of Notre Dame, and he has a PhD from Yale University. What is of particular relevance for us, and we have been in contact and in exchange with Gary for several decades now. No, we met, I remember, at UCSD while he was publishing a very important book on global commodity chains and global capitalism with Miguel Kortzenewicz. And this was very important for a lot of researchers, including Clemente Ruiz Duran, and we have been working on these topics for a long time, doing methodological, conceptual, and empirical work together with Gary and a large community. No? So I simply would like to finalize before giving the word to Gary that, well, he has been an important mother or father in lots of places in the world, and also doing empirical work on China, on yarn, textile, garment, global commodity chains and global value chains, etc. So we are very honored and very happy to have Gary.
Sorry, so I think I lost you at the very end there, Enrique. You were muted.
Yes.
For minutes.
I was simply ending saying that so the logic, how we do the cycle of conferences is a presentation of around 45 minutes, yep, and a more or less similar time for questions and answers through the chat. No?
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for the introduction, and as with you personally, I have a very long relationship with Mexico. My wife is from Mexico City, from UNAM and El Colegio de Mexico, and I always look forward to the opportunity to be involved in these conversations about how to understand the world. So let me first just bring up my PowerPoint slides and then give a introduction. Okay. Great. Okay, so what I'd like to do to set up our conversation is to look at this topic of global value chains or global supply chains that has been around for quite a while in terms of academic research, but as we all know, it's taken on quite a bit more significance in the broader public because of COVID-19 and the global health pandemic. And for many countries, I think global supply chains have moved from being an esoteric topic for economists or in business management schools to now becoming a matter of national security and a critical aspect for economic development. So what I'd like to do in the presentation is give an introduction, and I'm going to use global supply chains as the more general term. Sometimes I'll be using global value chains. I think they're very similar. So we'll take them as being synonymous, but I want to show why COVID-19 created so much emphasis on supply chains because of the disruptions and vulnerabilities that were created in supply chains that for most people were quite invisible until they stopped working. And then once they stop working, everybody begins to see the problems that are emerging. So I want to talk a bit about how this has been reflected in the US economy, particularly with the Biden administration that has placed a lot of emphasis on US supply chain vulnerabilities. They've had a major government report, and I was asked to testify before the US Senate Commerce Committee in July. And so I'll just give you a flavor of how the US is thinking about these issues. Then I want to raise an analytical point about a topic that has come out a lot in discussions of supply chains, which is the notion of resilience. Resilience is referring to how to recover from disruptions. So COVID-19 broke or disrupted a lot of supply chains or created bottlenecks. And it made countries and even firms aware of vulnerabilities to a smooth functioning of supply chains that were global in nature, cross-border. The question is, how does one put the pieces back together again after a period of disruption? Because firms and countries have faced disruptions in supply chains frequently, but often they're because of national disasters. Hurricane Katrina or the earthquake and tsunami in Japan, or other things that disrupt supply chains for a short period of time in certain places and certain industries. But what has been most important about COVID-19 over the last couple of years is that the effects have been global and across many industries. So I think this notion of resilience, which has emerged as one of the ways policymakers are talking about it, is somewhat simple in terms of trying to think about supply chains. So I'm going to introduce the idea that we can talk about resilient supply chains or healthier supply chains, but at three levels: firms, industry, and countries. Then I'm going to give some examples from the COVID-19 medical supplies and show how, if we're going to do a global value chain analysis, we really have to be quite product specific. Even in a sector like medical supplies, the dynamics and resiliency issues of supply chains vary by product. And I'm going to illustrate by looking at rubber gloves, face masks, ventilators, and vaccines for COVID-19 very briefly. But I want to do it partly to focus on the role of China. I know that Enrique's Centro at UNAM has been extremely influential in helping us better understand China's impact globally, but also in Latin America and Mexico in particular. So I'm going to focus on what we can see about China versus US relations and the role of the state in terms of medical supplies. And then I want to end with a discussion, and it's an open discussion, about industrial policy. In the context of developed countries like the United States, one of the key takeaways from the fragmentation of supply chains or disruption of supply chains is a sort of knee-jerk reaction. Well, let's end globalization. Let's bring these global supply chains back into the United States. And that's often captured around the phrase reshoring. The same discussions are occurring in Europe and parts of Asia. And I'll argue that reshoring is going to happen to some degree, but it doesn't guarantee either national security or resilience. And I want to end with a few questions about where does Mexico fit in, which I hope will fit into a broader discussion that we can have after my global supply chains and national security. As I mentioned earlier, COVID-19 raised public awareness of supply chain shortages. And they weren't just for medical supplies, which became quite acute. Things like face masks and hospital gowns and ventilators. But we began to see supply chain shortages in what appeared to be quite unrelated industries like food or toilet paper, and certainly service industries like airlines, hotels, restaurants have all been disrupted because they have such long supply chains that the shortage of workers when industries were closed down, or the inability to distribute products once supply has resumed, has really created very complex problems. And in addition to the kind of supply chain shortage issues, before COVID, similar questions about supply chains were rising around the theme of economic nationalism. When Brexit occurred and the UK was deciding on whether or not it was going to withdraw from the European Union, that raised questions about supply chains. When the Trump administration began with a series of tariffs and trade wars with China, Mexico, Canada, and other countries, that raised questions of supply chains, and it also has other dimensions, immigration and other topics. So economic nationalism, I think, is a contributing factor. And so in particular in 2020, with the when the Biden administration took over the presidency in the United States, they have also made supply chains a matter of national security. And this was a report that was published in June of this year, 2021, called Building Resilient Supply Chains, Revitalizing American Manufacturing and Fostering Broad-Based Growth. So kind of in the title of the report, you already can see how US policymakers are beginning to think about the issues. Supply chains have been fragmented or disrupted, so they want to rebuild them and they want to make them more resilient. But then there's also a political agenda about revitalizing American manufacturing. So part of rebuilding means rethinking what products are made where, by whom, and that's where the reshoring debate comes in. And then this even bigger issue of fostering broad-based or inclusive growth. So how is this going to help small firms? How is this going to help workers with different skill levels? How is this going to help rural areas versus urban areas? So all of these topics are being brought together under the supply chains label. And in this particular study, which is available online, and I would encourage people to look at it, they focus on 4 key industries: semiconductors, advanced batteries for electric vehicles, advanced pharmaceutical ingredients, active ingredients for various critical medicines, and critical and rare earth minerals. So it's a cross section. Each of those 4 sectors was studied by a different department in the United States. So Commerce Department did semiconductors, for example, and Health and Human Services did pharmaceuticals. But I think that the study itself is very important, both in terms of documenting what's going on in those 4 industries, but also giving us a sense of the policy issues that governments and the US government feels are involved here. In the context of that particular report, the US Senate Commerce Committee had hearings on implementing supply chain resiliency, and they asked me to testify on July 15th, and that testimony is all online. What was interesting is that there were 6 people called as witnesses in that particular hearing. I was the only academic. There were a few business people, but one of them was the research director of Intel, where semiconductors were a critical issue. And then there were other people bringing in business perspectives from different industries. So it's clearly a topic that the government has been concerned about. And since these hearings, a lot of different committees in the US that are now having to deal with supply chains from the point of view of the State Department, or different parts of Commerce or the Defense Department. So it's really become a hot political topic. Given this debate around COVID-19, there's a business side of this debate, which has existed for a long time, and it's been part of the whole discussion of globalization. Part of what globalization on the economic side has really began, I think, in the 1960s and 1970s, when American companies began to think about whether they should be setting up their supply chains as cross-border supply chains. And it began in a very simple way with programs like the Maquila program with Mexico, or programs we had in Puerto Rico or with the Philippines that was assembly operations. Companies in the US side of the border were sending products to the Mexican side of the border for simple assembly and re-export. For that to work, you had to have some kind of trade agreements so that those products, inputs or finished goods, wouldn't be taxed when they crossed the borders. But that version of globalization, the assembly version, was really simply to take advantage of differences in labor costs. But very quickly in the 1970s and 1980s, and especially accelerating in the 1990s, US companies began to realize that if you organized production on a global scale and you brought in countries all around the world, especially in Asia, where you had large countries, big populations, and a lot of sophisticated manufacturing capabilities, that you could introduce a lot of efficiencies. And so in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, virtually all industries became highly global. And they had multi-country supply chains, and that's what gave rise to these academic frameworks like global commodity chains that Enrique mentioned. We had that book came out in 1994. In the early 2000s, a group of people were brought together by the Rockefeller Foundation, and we were asked to create a framework that could link global supply chains and local development issues, and that became the Global Value Chains Initiative that I guess officially started around 2001. Global Production Networks is another name, supply chain management and business. So all of these different academic fields began to grow up in the 1990s and 2000s. And then they lead to trying to understand the issues of today. What I want to focus on in this concept of resilience, or how do you build sort of effective, efficient, sustainable supply chains, I think we have to look at the meaning at 3 different levels. From a company point of view, resilience means operational efficiency, and they're often trading off a cost optimization model where you try to put as much production in low-cost sites as possible, but you try to retain innovation and R&D close to home. But there's a second sort of an industry or supply chain version of resilience, which is defined by how the whole supply chain is organized. And we call that in the commodity chain or value chain literature, governance structures. But supply chains also refer to the geographic configuration of an industry. Where is production located around the world, and which regions and countries are most important? And then finally, there's this country level at which resilience is important, and that's what has emerged very much after COVID-19. And from a country point of view, resilience tends to refer in large part to national security issues. How can we assure the supply of essential goods that we don't have? Often we have used trade to get goods we don't have. But in the context of COVID, reshoring or repatriating production is one way. Another way to do it, national stockpiles is another way still. But countries also are concerned about other issues besides national security, economic and social and environmental goals. So generally, I think if we analyze resilience at these three levels, we can have a much better understanding of what it means. And so this slide is just to give a snapshot of the GVC, or Global Value Chain Framework, because that's the framework that I am approaching these issues from, and a lot of academics have adopted. And yet I think it's simplified or misused a lot of times by even international business scholars or policymakers. So from my point of view, GVC analysis requires a variety of things, including GVC mapping, which means analyzing where an entire supply chain, semiconductors or antibiotics or vaccines, where is that, where do all the activities in a particular industry occur? So that kind of value chain mapping requires us to understand products that from the raw material inputs, the final product, and also where it's distributed around the world. Then we have the topic of governance structures, which I mentioned earlier. We have to understand how the geography of value chains varies over time. A critical assumption of global value chain analysis, which is quite different from, say, supply chains, is value chain analysis is concerned with how value is distributed unevenly across supply chains. If you look at an iPhone, what % of an iPhone sales is going to Apple versus what % are going to the factories in China that make most of the iPhones? Well, turns out Apple gets about 40% of the total value created by iPhone sales, whereas the factories that make the iPhones in China get 2 or 3%. And issues like this come up in all of our value chains. Another topic is what's the role of the state in influencing not only the location of value chains, but distribution of value and the power dynamics. And then finally, to do good GVC analysis, I think we have to do it across countries, across industries, and over time. So this is just a snapshot. So what I'm going to do now is just give some quick examples in terms of the personal protective equipment industry, which has emerged as one of the areas of greatest concern with COVID-19 because of the shortages of so many medical supplies. And one of the things that has emerged because of COVID-19 is a much greater awareness of how much of these PPE supply chains were centered in Asia. Those that have studied international trade are very well aware it's not just PPE trade that's in Asia, but virtually all consumer goods, televisions, athletic footwear, smartphones, on and on. Most production is concentrated in a handful of countries in Asia for reasons of cost and capabilities, but we'll get a quick view of that here. In terms of medical supplies, it's important to distinguish personal protective equipment, which are basically low-tech commodity items like face masks or rubber gloves or hospital gowns, versus medical devices, which is a much more high-tech set of products, which could be like ventilators or heart pacemakers or other hearing aids, etc. PPE has been largely concentrated in Asia because of low cost and scale and just-in-time procurement. And I'm going to illustrate later that these 4 types of products, rubber gloves, face masks, ventilators, and vaccines, each of them has very different global value chain dynamics in terms of the structure of the industry and how we would try to correct the imbalances or the fragmentation or the disruption. So I'll give some illustrations of that going forward. If we just looked at the PPE side, and we tried to understand this before the pandemic, so these data come from 2018. Much of the world's imports of PPE came from China. So this chart just gives us a few examples. If we look at all personal protective equipment, about 50% of EU imports and about 48% of US imports come from China, which differs from other products, including like cosmetic devices, where the China participation is of PPE, protective garments, face masks, goggles, etc. Again, the China percent is still very high, typically over 50%. So China really became a target for a lot of the emphasis by policymakers about how do you redress the imbalances, or how do we fix the disruptions. And I just want to give a little bit more of an insight into how and why China played such an important role, and how China itself responded to COVID-19. Because as we know, the first cases of COVID-19 that were reported in December of 2019 were in Wuhan, China. And by January of 2020, China announced that COVID-19 was a very serious health crisis. And so for the first few months of 2020, January, February, March, China itself was absorbed in terms of trying to deal with COVID-19. But if we look before the pandemic, China exported more personal protective equipment than the rest of the world combined. China had a couple big advantages. It has low cost. It has a very large and diversified workforce, but it was also able to scale up production of key items in an unprecedented way. No other country in the world could match what China could do, and I'll illustrate in a couple of slides later how China did it. But it's also important to realize that China had some advantages on the supply side, but equally important are demand side factors of why US companies moved production out of the US to China, and why European companies did the same. And in the case of the US, US manufacturers for a long time had moved to the just-in-time production model pioneered by Japan, called lean manufacturing. But what was less, I think, understood is that hospitals and medical facilities, which are the largest source of demand for PPE, they also were involved in just-in-time purchasing. Because their budgets are relatively constrained, they were pushing US companies to move production either inside the US or to other countries where production costs would be lowest. So part of what was happening with the China concentration of PPE in a variety of products was China was able to supply not just at lower cost, but at higher quantities with very efficient distribution channels. So China's dominance was a combination of supply side and demand side factors. So what I want to do here is take those three levels that I mentioned, firm, industry, and country, and just show how that varies across the four products that I mentioned. This information comes from a paper that I've written with a couple colleagues, Pavita Pananand and Torben Peterson. That will be coming out in California Management Review. But I just want to illustrate why we need to have a product-specific analysis in terms of understanding the resilience and the supply chain fragmentation issue. So, and I'm going to be very quick on the 4 slides, and then I'll focus a little bit more on face masks, which is where China plays a much bigger role. So if we looked at rubber gloves, or sometimes called nitrile gloves, the very thin rubber gloves that are used by medical personnel and dentist office, doctor's offices, etc. In this case, the vast majority of those gloves came from two countries, Malaysia and Thailand. And production of those gloves was concentrated in Southeast Asia, in those two countries, largely because of raw material reasons. Natural rubber was very important and abundant in Malaysia and Thailand. And so the manufacturers there had resilience from what we might call operational efficiency. And shortages of rubber gloves were very short-lived because Malaysia and Thailand were able to maintain exports and production was concentrated in just two countries. So in this case, the trade mechanism actually allowed the resilience of rubber glove production to occur relatively quickly. And by the way, in all of these charts, I'm going to distinguish the crisis period, which is 2020 and 2021, when COVID-19 is causing disruptions. But I think analytically, we also have to ask ourselves about the post-pandemic period. You know, well, the response during a crisis could have one set of activities, but what's the new normal going to be like afterwards? When we look at face masks, and I'll show this in more detail, the key thing about face masks was scaling up production. Actually, most face masks, about 90% of face masks that were used in the US were imported from China, but only about 10% of them was for medical use. Most face masks were for industrial use, construction sites and the like. So in terms of dealing with face mask shortages, the question was, how quickly could production be scaled up, given that demand in face masks wasn't just from medical personnel, but was from the ordinary population? And I'm going to give some illustrations later about how China scaled up in a very different way than the US, and that referred to different roles of the state. And state-owned enterprises in China became very important, whereas multinational enterprises like 3M or Honeywell were the key actors in the US. Ventilators is a very interesting case that I won't go into in detail, but just to mention, and I'm sure we're all aware of it, in April and May in the US, ventilators were probably the product where people were most urgently seeking an increase in supply, because ventilators were for people that had COVID-19 that had to go to intensive care units. So literally, ventilators were the difference between life and death, because once you went to an ICU unit, you needed a ventilator to be able to breathe. But to get ventilators, which is a pretty complex product, having anywhere from 450 to 650 parts, the domestic suppliers of ventilators in the US were largely relatively small scale, and other countries didn't have large scale producers either, and everybody was using ventilators domestically. So what happened in this case is increase in production came through cross-industry collaborations. The companies that helped produce more ventilators in the US were largely automobile companies that had complex supply chains, some similar kinds of parts, and they partnered with smaller ventilator makers to make ventilators in the US. In the UK, they also used automakers, but they used other companies like vacuum cleaner and home appliance companies. So this is a different kind of solution to the problem of shortages of supply, cross-industry collaboration. And vaccines, which we're all aware has been a very, very complicated and kind of miraculous story of vaccines being a number, 8 to 10 vaccines coming out in about a year. This has required a lot of state-supported collaborative innovation. And we know that there are several vaccines that have come out of US-European collaborations, like Pfizer and AstraZeneca and Moderna, but there's also Chinese vaccines and Russian vaccines and Indian-made vaccines, which are circulating around the world. So the point of this is just to say each of these different products requires a different kind of analysis that varies at the firm level, the global value chain or industry level, and the country level in terms of how resilience was dealt with. And we try to provide a lot of details. But let me focus now just on face masks, because I think face mask is a relatively simple product. We all understand what they are, but it's one that very directly involved China and the United States taking two quite different strategies to increasing the supply of face masks. And I want to highlight in particular on the role of the state in scaling up production. There's other things that are going on. There's a lot of good articles about face mask production, like the one mentioned here. And when we're looking at or talking about face masks, we have to distinguish the relatively simple surgical masks, like this blue one here, versus more sophisticated masks like the N95 mask, which reduces the number of particles that come through to a very, very small number. And before the pandemic, face masks were very inexpensive. The surgical mask, you could get a surgical mask for 100 masks for $4, or a few pennies each. And even the N95 masks were relatively inexpensive. But what's critical about face masks is the filters that were required to screen out the bacteria and the viruses. And so face masks tended to have these different layers. And in particular, the filter was created by a kind of non-woven polypropylene fabric that was widely used in a lot of other products. And to make this PPP fabric, you had to use a melt-blown technology to really create nanofibers and very, very small fibers to trap the viruses. So it kind of describes the process here. And even a simple face mask, like an N95, itself has 65 parts. So one of the things people underestimate when they're thinking about these products is we don't really understand the complexity of value chains just from the kinds of supplies that go into relatively simple products. So this would be a picture of what one of those filters looks like. And when you use this kind of melt-blown process, you're creating these incredibly small microfibers that are arranged in ways that trap bacteria and viruses, which is very different, of course, from just using a cloth mask like we've seen people do. So the key was producing these filters using non-woven fabric, and that fabric was in short supply around the world. You required pretty capital-intensive facilities to make melt-blown fabric, and that's something that both China and the US could do. What was interesting about China, which was the leading face mask supplier in the world, is that it scaled up its production and incredibly rapidly. So I'll just cut this non-woven fabric. China scaled up its production to 150 tons a day in February, March, April. That's 5 times what China made before the pandemic, 15 times the total output of all US companies that made these face masks. Whereas when you asked, American companies were being pressured to do this as well, but the big American suppliers like 3M and Honeywell were being pushed by the Trump administration to scale up production, which they had spread around the world. And they could do it, but they said if they make investments in capacity now, they would only do it if the government gave them guaranteed orders. So basically, they could scale it up, but in a temporary way, whereas China was pushing its companies to scale up more permanently. How did China do it? Well, it organized or coordinated PPE supply in a very key ministry or interministerial committee within China called National Development and Reform Commission. Very importantly, China relied on its petroleum state-owned enterprises, Sinopec and PetroChina, to actually make the production of these key intermediates. So in the US case, you've got these two big multinationals that are private and global. In the China case, they leaned on state enterprises that could move very, very quickly. And they ended up scaling up these really dramatic levels. China also was asking a lot of the tech companies in China, the Chinese government, Chinese state, to create face masks. So Foxconn alone, for example, added 2 million face masks daily to its production capacity. So the China story is partly about the Chinese state being able to orchestrate production of critical inputs using both state enterprises and tech companies inside China. And you get a picture like this. In the early months of the pandemic, so this is pre-pandemic, this is 2018, January 2018, the kind of exporting of face masks from China and the rest of the world looked like this, and the volumes of face masks being exported were relatively low. In the first month, countries put export controls around PPE, so nobody, including China, was exporting to the rest of the world because they were using it for domestic consumption. But as a result of the scale up I was just describing, here's what happens to China's exports to the rest of the world: April, May, June, July, August of 2020. It skyrockets. And of course, China's production is the bulk of what's happening in the rest of the world. So the point is, China's ability to scale up domestically in terms of critical ingredients is what enables them to become this critical exporter during the pandemic itself, which was no other country was able to match that. In the US case, PPE was never a top priority under the Trump administration. From the beginning, the Trump officials were focused on vaccines. They saw vaccines as where they wanted to spend most of their money, and they created this project called Operation Warp Speed. And also, there was a reluctance to even recognize in the US and Europe how big of a problem the global pandemic was going to be. It was only in mid-March that people began to talk about the need to socially distance and to wear face masks. And in the US case, that Trump used the Defense Production Act, which was kind of a wartime act to help to force companies to produce higher quantities of a good. And that was typically when you were dealing with war materials like tanks and military equipment. What was used here to try to get companies like GM and General Motors and 3M to increase their production. And it worked, but only short term. Trump and the US was really focused mainly on vaccines, and that's probably true of Europe as well. The US private sector did increase their output of face masks much, much less rapidly than we saw in China, but it increased output 4-fold to 8-fold between March and August. The partnerships were kind of slow and it wasn't very profitable. The key, I think, from the US perspective was initially there was a denial that the pandemic was going to be a big problem. Then there was slow decision making, a lot of bureaucratic problems in terms of planning, et cetera. So I think in the US case, the face mask shortages were much more of a policy failure than a market failure. Governments only became aware of the problem relatively late, and then they pushed to get a response, and private companies responded more or less rapidly, but slow. The success story would have been vaccines, but I don't want to go into that right now. What I want to do is take this case of the shortages of products created by COVID-19 and how different countries like US and China dealt with the shortages in these different ways and used the state in different ways to raise the question of whether industrial policies might create more resilient supply chains after the pandemic, and if so, how they would do that. And here I only have a few slides. I'm going to be relatively quick, but this is really more to open a discussion with the audience, because I think these are questions that are very much being debated. right now in all countries, certainly in the United States, and I'm sure in Mexico as well. So in the context of the Biden administration and the report that we saw about rebuilding these disrupted supply chains, it seems like there's several main options to reduce the rigidity of the global supply chains and build greater resilience. And all of them have been pursued to some degree. One is we could make global supply chains more domestic. And you can make them more domestic partly by reshoring or trying to bring production back into the US. And you would see this from simple products like face masks or even ventilators to much more complicated products like smartphones. So there's been a big part of the anti-globalization debate in the US is that globalization has gone too far. It's diminished the vitality of the American manufacturing sector, and it's cost a lot of US jobs. And so part of this debate is a kind of bring the past back, return to the glory years, whenever those were, when manufacturing was much more central to the US economy. Another approach is just make supply chains shorter. So instead of just having global supply chains largely concentrated in Asia, places like China, India, Vietnam, Korea, Singapore, etc., make them shorter. And this is this nearshoring option that if we regionalize production, such as US focusing more on Mexico and Central America, or Western European countries sourcing much more from Central and East European countries, or East Asian countries sourcing more from Southeast Asian, Central Asian, Southern Asian, we get more regional supply chains. This has been occurring, by the way, long before COVID. I think the regionalization of supply chains is a fact. If we look at the automotive supply chain in North America, it's very regional, US, Mexico, Canada. If you look at the aerospace supply chain in Europe, it's very regional. Many countries are contributing to the production of Airbuses or Boeing planes. If we look at East Asia's electronics supply chains, also very regional. China might be doing final assembly and exporting, but other countries in East Asia are making critical inputs like South Korea or Taiwan or Japan. So regional supply chains have been around, but in the case of particular products that are now becoming in crisis mode, like semiconductors or pharmaceuticals, the potential solution is to try to rebuild or strengthen regional supply chains. And a third option is to just make supply chains more diversified. You don't have to be limited by geography. You can reduce dependence on a few key suppliers. Like in pharmaceuticals, most of the imports are coming from China and India. Well, you could build up alliances with trusted partners around the world. Ireland, for example, is a very important supplier, Singapore of other products as well. So a country like the US could have trusted partners that are international or global. So all of these options, making supply chains more domestic or shorter or more diversified, are all potential solutions. And I think all of them have merit to some degree. The issue that I think is a key problem for a lot of the policy discussions is the focus on reshoring, as everybody recognizes, by itself doesn't guarantee resiliency. If making things more constrained locally doesn't reduce the fact that shortages can occur inside the US. Last year, Texas had tremendous ice storms. The Texas power grid wasn't connected to the rest of the US power grid. Texas was out of power for 2 weeks. So making things more local can increase the risk. So I think we do need to think about supply chains that are international, but we might reconfigure the mix. And I think another critical issue is where innovation comes from. As with vaccines, the highest value comes from innovation, and especially the advanced industrial countries don't want to lose that. I think some challenges to some of the resilience issues are around these sorts of topics. Supply chain transparency, just knowing how a supply chain is organized, usually policymakers and firms even don't know very much about how their whole supply chain is organized. In talking to colleagues in the US Embassy in Mexico, they were mentioning that when the US was facing shortages of certain products and they wanted to turn to Mexico in the summer or the spring of 2020 to try to increase production from Mexican factories, often the CEOs of the US companies didn't know what was being made in which factories, in which countries within Mexico or elsewhere. So supply chain transparency is a problem even for firms, but it's particularly a problem for policymakers. So one question is, how do you create more supply chain transparency going forward? How confidential a lot of it is. There's been an emphasis on something called resiliency stress tests. You see this coming out of business schools a lot. You know, look at your supply chain, see where the vulnerabilities, or see where your critical inputs are, and then try to figure out how to build in redundancy at critical places in the supply chain. I mean, in principle, this makes sense, but again, it's very costly to do this kind of analysis. Only the biggest companies will have the resources to be able to do this kind of stress test. So I don't think it's a general solution because we still have the supply chain transparency problems. I think diversified sourcing with trusted partners is a good route to go, and a lot of countries are looking at that. This requires regional and global connections. And then another big problem is just the importance of policy coordination. If you went back to the face mask case in the United States, even for a simple product like face masks, there was incredible gaps in communication. The White House had a team that was looking at face masks and PPE. The Center for Disease Controls had another team. Health and Human Services had another team. Food and Drug Administration, none of them were coordinated. People didn't know not only where things were, but once you produce goods, there was no plan for how to distribute it among the 50 states. So policy coordination is a big issue inside countries. And I think increasingly in the US, I know there's a US-EU Trade and Technology Council being created to try to coordinate solutions for these issues across those two regions. I want to end with this slide, which is really an open set of questions that Enrique and I have been discussing for a good while, but I just want to sort of raise these in terms of this audience, who most of you will know a lot more about these things than I do, but questions for Mexico are the ones like I have on this slide. You know, can Mexico's manufacturing supply chains compete with China? This has been a question that it really was emerging since the early 2000s. When China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, its exports of consumer goods skyrocketed. And between 2001 and 2010, China's exports to the US took market share away from Mexico's exports to the US in the vast majority of industries. So Mexico was losing ground to China's export surge. But the question now is, you know, what's Mexico's current situation? You know, the Trump administration created this kind of US-China trade war by raising tariffs on imports from China. And a lot of people felt like that would create an opening for Mexico to perhaps fill that void to some degree. And in listening to recent discussions of this and reading about it, it seems like Mexico really didn't take advantage of that window. Mexico, definitely China has lost some ground, and other countries have been replacing China's imports to the US, but often they've been other Asian countries or even countries from other regions of the world. When you look at foreign direct investment coming into Mexico the last few years, it's been flat. Local Mexican firms haven't really zeroed in terms of taking advantage of critical shortages. So this is an open question. How do you make Mexico's supply chains more competitive with China? And I think one of the ways to do it could be through regional integration. And this is the second question. Is Mexico poised to take advantage of the Biden administration's emphasis on rebuilding US supply chains? I think this is really a question that has been around since the creation of NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. And an industry like automobiles or in aerospace or even medical supplies, Mexico's exports to the US have been very closely linked to US demand. And lots of, when you look at US imports from Mexico, about 40% of US imports from Mexico have US content, meaning US firms exported to Mexico's initial products, and those products are now part of the final export back to the US. US imports from China have only 5 to 10% US content. So Mexico already had a big advantage in terms of regional integration, but can it sustain it? A third question is, what's the current policy context in Mexico? And then Enrique and I had a long discussion about this. I don't know too much about the AMLO administration. I know that López Obrador is perceived in the US as a kind of populist and a nationalist in terms of wanting to strengthen the Mexican economy in a very, very different way than the Trump administration did. So nationalists are very different stripes. But I was thinking back to the administration of Echeverria back in the 1970s. When I was studying the pharmaceutical industry in Mexico for my dissertation, it seemed to me Echeverria administration had a very clear industrial strategy, industrial policy based on late stage import substitution. And it had an administrative bureaucracy to implement that. You had offices that were looking at, foreign investment promotion and screening, technology transfer agreements, local content programs, etc. My simple understanding today is, and listening to people talk about Mexico who are working on it today, is Mexico has nothing like that sort of bureaucratic apparatus needed to organize a really effective supply chain response to these shortages of the sort that we see in South Korea, Japan, Singapore, Taiwan. All of those countries had economic planning boards or have economic planning boards that are very aware of what the strengths and capabilities of local firms are and how to try to orchestrate upstream and downstream connections to make local firms stronger and better exporters. So I think that's an open question. What can Mexico do today? And a final question is just, if you were going to do a GBC strategy to strengthen Mexico's supply chains, what would it look like? And I know Enrique's center has provided incredibly useful disaggregated trade data, China, Mexico, and Mexico with other countries. But I think if we took industries like autos or aerospace or medical supplies, where Mexico is already very strong and has exports to the US, a GBC analysis would try to really zero in on critical inputs or segments that could have high value for Mexico, require relatively sophisticated technology, and try to build up production in those parts of the supply chain, similar to what China did with the polypropylene nonwoven fabric for the face mask. So let me stop here and just raise these kinds of questions as something that I think we all might have some kind of a opinion about, and then open it up for broader discussion, either from Enrique or from other people in the audience. So Enrique, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, thank you very much, dear Gary. I would probably start saying that we will not finish this dialogue today, and hopefully we could do some kind of seminar or a more in-depth analysis, more on the methodology of global value chains, on this mapping of these masks and ventilators, in the case of China, no? Because what you are highlighting is that even in the case of an apparent primitive commodity such as masks, they are not primitive at all, but China is able, with its characteristics, it's able to react in a way that other countries and firms have not been able to do so. No? So you pose a lot of questions that we will, of course, not be able to respond all in half an hour. We already have a group of questions, Gary, but I would like simply to highlight the issue that you mentioned in a very fair and transparent way at the end with questions, no? To highlight the issue of how even firms probably, but also the public sector officials and even academics in most cases, are not very well prepared for a new discussion on the state and industrial policy. No? This is not only in academics. Older academics might probably still remember debates on industrial policy 30, 40 years ago. Younger academics not. Public officials today have been working in Mexico for 30 or 40 years under neoliberal policies, and they are not prepared, but they do not believe in the state and industrial policies. And by the way, based on your presentation, even firms have problems in reshoring because they have been always looking for Asia and other countries, and now suddenly they are in Duke and have to look in their neighborhood how to reshore. They are academically, in many cases, probably badly prepared. I don't know if you could respond to that, and then I will get back to a good group of questions that we already have, no?
Yeah, so let me just highlight something you have very, I think, correctly emphasized, which is that the firms themselves admit that they are ill-prepared to understand supply chains beyond first-tier suppliers at best. And that's usually the biggest firms. And it's partly because the way that the supply chains at lower tiers has been orchestrated really requires different parts of the organization that are in different regions to understand how the supply chain works. So when I was looking, when Don Wyman and I were working on manufacturing miracles, and I was in Korea and Taiwan and other places trying to understand how buyer-driven supply chains operated, I went to Seoul and Hong Kong and Taipei and did interviews with the overseas buying offices for all the big US retailers, Kmart and Walmart and Liz Claiborne and many of the other. Those buying offices themselves were really complicated 200, 300 person units whose job it was to find suppliers in different parts of Asia and report that back to the headquarters. And these were retailers. These weren't even manufacturers. So I think part of the problem of supply chain transparency is that even in relatively simple products, you have to have a knowledge of local conditions to understand where factories can occur that requires this kind of global organization. And when you get to the big manufacturers like the airlines, the aircraft companies or the auto companies or the big electronics firms that control a lot more production, again, they have some sense of where their key suppliers are, but often their key suppliers are subcontracting to lower tier suppliers. And that's often where the vulnerabilities in supply chains occur. So I would say if we're going to target certain sectors as being critical, like semiconductors, which the US is clearly targeting, or automobiles, we would need to have an organization of companies and policymakers together to kind of figure out the current situation of those supply chains and what strategic moves are needed. And in countries like Singapore, Japan, and say Taiwan or South Korea, where they do this the best, I think their entire economic planning board is made up of engineers that really look at it from a systems perspective. And they do map those supply chains, and they do try to figure out what can we do, what's the rest of the world doing, but it requires a level of detail that is an investment. As the kind of investment Mexico made in the 1970s under Echeverria when they were trying to do the kind of industrial policy then. And it's a kind of investment Asian countries do more than US, probably even European. So I think that's just something that the question is, how do we get a policy, a set of policymakers giving enough importance to these issues that they are going to create new offices? And final point, I've been hearing in my discussions with people in the US Commerce Department and elsewhere that they're now planning or talking about creating supply chain units inside different parts of the US, this kind of value chain mapping and coordination with private sector firms. But it requires, as we know from a research point of view, a lot of really detailed work. And because these industries are constantly changing, even the kind of report that the Biden administration put out in June 2021 will become obsolete in 12 months. If you don't keep tracking those industries, old knowledge is not a useful guide to future policy.
Well, thank you very much, Gary. And again, lots of food for discussion and doing research. Look, there are more than 10, 15 questions. Again, we will probably not be able to approach all of them, but one question more conceptual and methodological, and then a lot of more detailed empirical debates, Gary, no? One post by Manuel in which he highlights, in your opinion, why is this approach, methodological approach of global value chains so popular today? No? This might be surprising for you. Probably, I remember when we met in 1994, you probably did not expect the boom of this approach today, no? And how do you link this to this more state-directed development theory in East Asian countries, etc.? No, what is your opinion on this development of your thought in more than 30 years? No,
it's a great question, and I've been thinking about it quite a bit, just tracking the field. A couple things. One, I think one of the reasons it became important is when globalization occurred, where international supply chains became more and more common in all industries. I think individual companies could no longer track them. So if you went back and you read Alfred Chandler's early works on the rise of the multi-divisional firm, up until about the 1960s, the big multinationals, like the big auto companies, the big computer companies, they coordinated all of these linkages inside the firm. But once you have global outsourcing and offshore production, it means that you get far more complexity. So part of the reason it was popular is just tracking these global industries was something you couldn't do by companies alone. And the fact that GVCs was set up as a firm-centered perspective was important. We took supply chains as real and as important. A second reason I think for popularity is we focused on power in the chain. We made an assumption that most economists did not make, was that in most of these global supply chains, lead firms, whether they were manufacturers or retailers or brands, played an incredibly important role, not only in orchestrating how the chain is set up, but in deciding who captures value where. And I think that realization that these power asymmetries meant that understanding the strategies of the big companies could help us address some of the development problems was really key. I think third, the people that created the global value chains approach and global commodity chains were basically coming out of development studies, not business studies. If we were looking at this from business schools only, you just look at the organizational complexity, you try to figure it out. but there wasn't really a critical issue on what's that mean for jobs? What's that mean for wages? What does that mean for value distribution? But the people that created the value chain approach, like the people at IDS and Sussex and other researchers, were really focusing bottom up on these supply chains. And therefore that gave us a policy angle. When I was looking at the pharmaceutical industry in Mexico in the 1970s, my question was, to what degree is Mexico going to be able to capture some of the technology that's being created in this industry in Mexico, but that maybe is being pulled into the US when a company like Syntex goes from being a Mexican company to being a US company. So I think because it was a framework that was created by development researchers, it automatically had policy relevance. And I think a final question then would be the role of international organizations. Because you can do everything I mentioned already. You can, what gets done where by who. You could see the policy angle, but that's just country by country. I think what really gave the GVC framework its legitimacy, different from any other academic approach, was it's being adopted by the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and the International Labor Organization in different ways as a framework that could really help them understand how to address the concerns of individual countries. And the ILO was one of the first, the International Labor Organization. They had a project called Global Production and Local Jobs. And they wanted to know whether global production was good for workers in different countries. If so, how? So I think it's kind of all of those different elements, including scaling up to being adopted by international organizations as a framework that was useful because of its development focus. I think all of that has helped create the popularity we now see in the approach. And then that creates more feedback for researchers, including economists who do a lot of sophisticated modeling, like Paul Antris at Harvard, to look at global value chains as something that they wanted to understand, even from a modeling or big data perspective.
No, thank you very much. And again, to the audience, I would very strongly advise to look at the publications of Gary, including also the Global Value Center, no, where these arguments have been detailed for a long time. 3 or 4 additional questions, Gary, from the questions we have. No, one, Gary, is the issue that you highlighted in your presentation of coordination of policies. No, Francisco Valderrey asks us, referring to recent Fed of the Treasury in the US policies, how relevant are, from your perspective, the issue of coordination between macro, micro, meso policies and sectorial policies? No, you might have new arguments and policies by the Biden administration, as you highlighted, but then you have a huge, many instruments, some older ones, some more recent ones. How do they work together? No.
And I think the way it happens is you have to take a sort of a key issue, let's say like semiconductors, which is on everybody's mind, and or vaccines, which was on everybody's minds, and then figure out, in order to maintain innovation and production going forward, what pieces have to come together. In the abstract, we could make arguments about how macro and meso or micro should come together. But I think that when we start now, I think how the Biden administration has done it is when it put out that supply chain report. And now it's realizing, in order to understand semiconductors, it has to create a council of private firms and policymakers that are working together across these units. Or when it's doing vaccines, it needs to deal with the problem that occurred in the White House versus CDC versus Health and Human Services. But I see now with, let's say, US-EU Trade and Technology Council, when they're going to start looking at things like the big data companies and what's happening with data privacy of Google, Facebook, et cetera, those countries realize that they've each got a different perspective, but they all have the same problem. So I think that the policy coordination is driven by key issues that become targets or focal questions that force people to realize that to address that question, like big data in the service sector or e-commerce or whatever, that you need coordination. I think you can make abstract arguments, but it's much more powerful when you start to see that to deal with key sectors, and that's why I would go back to Mexico to autos. If I'm in Mexico and I realize how important the automobile industry, the complex is, and I would try to figure out what are the missed opportunities, perhaps, that Mexico might have or the US might have by not having greater coordination, I would try to build coordination around that. So that's, I would be very practical and try to look at where coordination does occur when certain industries maybe build out from that and say, okay, what could we do more generally? Final example, stockpiles with ventilators. There was so much emphasis on producing ventilators. The US had a stockpile that was less than 10,000 ventilators in May 2020. They built it up to 95,000 ventilators by August. Except that by August, ventilators were not in high demand anymore because the way people were treated in hospitals allowed them to stay out of the ICUs. So then now you have a supply-demand problem. Everybody thought on the supply side, we would need a certain high demand of ventilators. And it turns out it became a complete glut. So how do you avoid that kind of problem in the future? And that's, so a problem like stockpiles then says, what's the policy solution to prevent that from happening more generally? So that's how I would kind of do it inductively. I would look at key industries, ask about how policy does or doesn't come together, and then try to generalize from that about a more general framework.
Okay. Look, another question from Sarah Wong. No? She asks, well, we have been discussing on China, the United States, Mexico, and other countries. And what about smaller countries? No, I mean, at the end, the world is not these three countries. And she's asking about, for example, the Andean countries, no, such as Colombia, Ecuador. Do they play any role at all in this global picture and global trends of global value chains? And the second question, which is very relevant, I believe, what does this mean for Latin America and the Caribbean regionalization? Does this imply that Latin America should somehow again industrialize, contrary to what has been happening in the last 20 years, by the way, and also as a result of its new relationship with China, no? What are your thoughts on this, no? Note the criticism, not necessarily to you, but to stand up and say, there are some countries missing, no?
Sure. So let me give three responses. One on the small countries question. You look at a country like Costa Rica or Ireland, and they have become very effective at identifying certain niches that they play and higher and more complex industries and building up some capability. So again, I think there are technically very capable countries that have become linked to supply chains in critical ways, but partly because they have a kind of an innovation ecosystem that helps create highly skilled workers. If you have other countries like in the Andean group of Latin America, regional trade agreements actually organized for regional markets could be another way to go. In other words, with global supply chains, small countries often are at the very bottom of the chain with the least value added, and they're the most vulnerable. So either you have a privileged niche like a Singapore or Ireland or Costa Rica does in medical supplies, where they have very strong ties to the leading companies, or if you're smaller countries, you try to create, I think, regional associations that give you a little bit more clout in terms of producing as a group for a region. The Latin American country question is very interesting because South America in particular, but South America, like Southeast Asia, is very much a commodities-driven set of countries. I mean, their real strength is natural resource exports. And looking at countries like Chile and Peru, they have become, and Uruguay, they've become very sophisticated in creating high-value services related to their commodities. You know, Uruguay, for example, which has one of the largest cattle exporting industries, has created the microchip that goes on the ear of every cow that identifies where it is in a herd in case disease comes out. Chile has done a lot of things connected to mining, et cetera. So I think, to me, I wouldn't think Brazil is a special separate case, of course, because it does a lot of everything, manufacturing and commodities. But if you're a commodity-rich country, one route to go is looking at how high-value services can increase your clout in these value chains. And often that's building on capabilities you had internally, but you didn't even realize had a global market. I do want to say something more generally about, let's say, WTO, last point, and the least developed countries. A couple of weeks ago with Stephanie Barrientos, who you know, and a guy named Ari Van Asch, we wrote an open letter to the Director General of the World Trade Organization, which is having a big trade ministerial end of November, early December, pushing a proposal that others have created called Global Value Chains for Least Developed Countries. And the report that was created in the European Commission showed how a lot of the least developed countries actually create a lot of value downstream. But if you looked at trade, not just from a country point of view, but in terms of the whole value chain, you could create a system of preferences that would privilege or that would reward value added by those countries in different parts of the value chain. So this is an example of ways where I think an international organization like WTO might be able to take a GVC perspective and focus on least developed countries. And I'll circulate that you later, and maybe you can put it as a link, the open letter to your on the website for follow on. But I think those kind of discussions involving the multilateral organizations that have global reach. And I really think organizations like ILO or WTO, even the World Bank, are kind of facing an identity crisis right now. Almost how are they relevant anymore? The biggest developing countries have more money than they do for a lot of development projects. So in a sense, they're the most important countries for the less developed or smaller countries that don't have the knowledge resources. So I think trying to figure out what programs can be relevant today, given the way the global economy is organized, I think you can do it through a global value chain angle. And this example of the open letter to the DG of the WTO could be one example for your for us to think about.
It would be great if you could share the letter. We will inform our audiences. No,
yes.
Two more questions, and then
Yes.
we'll let you rest, dear Gary. One group of questions, Gary, from Montserrat Mejia, Jesus Alvarez, Miguel Angel, refers to the following, and based on your presentation, based on your recent research, no, on health products and commodities, and based on new global value chains, nearshoring, regional production, local production in some cases, does the governance structure of the respective global value chains change? Are they in some cases maybe initially supply-driven and then demand-driven, or do you see some power governance changes, or they remain as they were?
Great question. And I think the answer is yes, there's a big change. And the big change is actually coming from platform economies or platform firms, or the so-called digital economy. You know, there's still a lot of dynamics of buyer-driven or producer-driven chains that are still different, newer versions of the same game. But I think the real game changer has been internet-based firms. So the biggest platform companies like Google or Facebook or Microsoft is changing the way goods are being sold, distributed, et cetera. And I think that has the potential to disrupt the previous governance structures. Just taking one example, Junku Lee and I, did a recent paper on smartphones. The biggest smartphone producers that people have been paying attention to were Apple and Samsung and Huawei. But Google has actually become a big player in the smartphone market on the hardware side, leveraging its software and kind of cloud platform-based advantages. So I think, yes, the biggest change is how is the digital economy, which has been around, really been accelerating since about 2015. How is the digital economy and so-called platform companies changes are underway that are very disruptive for existing chains?
Oh, very interesting. And one last question, Gary, and based on the questions of Fernando Samperio and Pablo Iscoatl Lopez Fosado. And regarding the discussion, Gary, of new policies under the Biden administration, and specifically in the semiconductor global value chain, vis-a-vis China also, no? What is your opinion, and if you can again highlight this new policy approach under the Biden administration, and what are the risks and challenges in the short, medium run? What is the potential of gaining lost ground, etc.? What is your impression of all this debate on semiconductors? No.
So I'll give two quick impressions. I mean, I think there's two different debates. One debate is about cutting edge semiconductor production of the most advanced sort for 5G networks. And that debate is focused on three companies, Samsung, Intel, and TSMC from Taiwan, which are all involved in who can produce the semiconductors that actually have the smallest nodes, and they're measured in nanometers. So it used to be that 10 was the smallest. Now TSMC is at 5, and Intel and IBM are involved in a project to go down to 2 or 3. So one question is at the cutting edge, and Huawei, which is a big one, is still back at the 20 nanometer level. So I mean, China feels like they're in a catch-up stage. A bigger issue, though, has been that a lot of the shortages of semiconductors are around the legacy products like automobiles and consumer electronics, where semiconductor products are in short supply because factories are focusing more on high-end production. So this is, again, the problem of the supply chain transparency. Automotive companies have shortages of certain kind of semiconductors. They don't know where to find them. They could probably be produced by a mid-sized company, but without knowing what that product is and how many other companies have demand for it, we can't solve that problem. So I think there's cutting edge problems and legacy problems. And let me just close with a third remark, which is that I think a lot of the most interesting policy initiatives or solutions are actually bottom-up, community-driven or state-driven. It's not national policy, which is prone to having a lot of bureaucratic kind of infighting and collaboration. But you start looking at cities, whether this is in US, Europe, China, who are doing innovation policies to attract certain kinds of companies. They actually can act more quickly, and they pick niches or industries where they feel they could make a difference. So just Durham, North Carolina, where I'm located, Google, Apple, Amazon, they're all putting in place engineering hubs of 2,000 or so workers here, because there's already an ecosystem to do things like quantum computing, artificial intelligence, et cetera. So maybe one of the ways we can actually break out of just thinking about this macro or even meso level is to think micro down at the community level, where you can actually perhaps control policies and be very targeted in how you could make a difference in the supply chains. And that might produce a lot more policy innovation than we see if we just focus top down.
Well, Gary, we know we could be here for a longer time, but thank you very much for sharing your views. It's an honor to have you here. Congratulations on your consistency for several decades, and I can assure you that you have there are lots of trees all over, also in Mexico, working with your proposed methodological approach, and think seriously about the possibility of maybe, it doesn't have to be this year, but maybe to have a brief seminar of 3 or 4 sessions on particular topics, even together with your center, no? I think there would be a lot of interest, no? But again,
I would definitely enjoy that and welcome it. Yeah, I welcome it. And I also want to thank so many people in the audience who are long-term friends like yourself, who I know, and I look forward when we can get back together face-to-face. Zoom is great, but face-to-face is better.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your patience today in the morning.
You're welcome.
No, I'm sorry for the misunderstanding.
No problem. That's my pleasure. Bye-bye.
We'll keep in touch, and thank you very much for the audience. No?
Okay, thanks to the audience. Bye.
Have a good day, Gary.
Okay.
Thank you.
Gracias. Saludos.
Ciao.
Ciao.